الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين أما بعد. Inshallah, we would like to warmly welcome our brother Subboor Ahmad. He is from IERA. Those who do not know what IERA stands for, is Islamic Education and Research Academy. Brother Subboor Ahmad is a well-known public speaker and writer who has debated prominent academics on philosophy and science. He is currently pursuing his postgraduate studies in philosophy and has a particular interest in the philosophy of biology, and is specializing in this field. Brother Subboor Ahmad is the head of the Mission Dawah and an instructor and a lecturer in IERA. In this age of science and reason, novel questions are being raised about God, science, and Darwinian evolution, and especially Islamic relationship with science, and in particular, Darwinian evolution. Brother Subboor Ahmad will, inshallah, cover this topic in his lecture tonight, and our brother Subboor Ahmad just recently debated with Arun Ra in Houston concerning the subject. Without further ado, I would like to invite Brother Subboor Ahmad to talk about Islam, evolution, and Darwinism. Jazakumullah.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. I want to start off with this verse because this is one of those verses which always stands out to me, because a promise of Allah is to be fulfilled. And a promise of Allah is such that we do not say inshallah at the end of it. So we do not say inshallah this promise of Allah will be fulfilled, because we know that that promise will be fulfilled. It's already something which Allah has willed, and something which Allah has willed will happen regardless of how many people on earth think it will not happen, regardless of whether people are working towards that goal or they're not working towards that goal. Now Allah promises in the Quran, it is He who sent His messenger with guidance and the religion, with the guidance and the religion of truth, that He may make it prevail over all religions. And sufficient is Allah as a witness. This promise comes in the Quran 3 times. Once at the end of it, Allah says, and sufficient is Allah as a witness. Another, Allah says, even if the disbelievers hate it. And another time, even if the polytheists hate it. The fact of the matter is, what we have to realize as Muslims is it is our duty as Muslims to convey the message of Islam to humanity. Just a few days ago, I was in Toronto. We were on a dawah mission there. We were doing some training, some street dawah and other things. And as you do as a human being, over time, you start losing motivation with anything. Anything that you do in life, you start losing motivation. So we were on our way to give dawah in this place called Young and Dundas. And me being a human being, I started to, oh, it's cold, and, I wasn't really feeling like giving dawah that day. But I just told myself, no, I need to go for the sake of Allah, and I just need to go speak to people. So we were there, we started interacting with people, and I had this long discussion with somebody who was an Islamophobe. He was just bringing up this issue and that issue and this issue and that issue, and you people are like this, and all the vile things you can imagine that they throw at us. And at that time, I just tried to remain calm. One, because it was cold, so you can't get angry, because it's Canada and it's very, very cold. It's hard to get angry when you're cold. Secondly, it's simply because there's a whole bunch of very nice, polite non-Muslims around there, and if they see me getting angry, they're going to look at this Muslim guy getting angry at this guy and whatnot. Anyway, I tried to remain calm as I could, tried to finish off the conversation. And as we do in all conversations, he was bringing up, terrorism and this and that. I was trying to bring everything back to Tawheed. Because at the end of the day, that is our goal. Our goal is not to clarify misconceptions, right? Our ultimate goal is to call to Allah. And as I wrapped up that conversation, and then I was really cold, and one of my friends said, let's go inside to eat, there's a place there. I said, okay, fine. And as we were walking, this guy said, can I just speak to you? Are you on your way somewhere? Can I just speak to you? And he was actually listening to my earlier conversation. So I said, yeah, sure. Anyway, he said, I'm basically dying. I'm 20 years old. I've been diagnosed with brain and lung cancer. I just came into this place to donate $40,000 to children's center, and just tell me about Islam. Like, you know, he just wanted to know what to do. And when I heard this, I was shocked. There was another da'i from Canada who was there, and he's been giving dawah there for about 8 years. 8 years he's been giving dawah in that spot. And this is a big guy. I mean, he looks like, you know, if you see him in an alleyway, if a non-Muslim sees him, he probably looks at him and thinks, okay, this guy is the right-hand man of, you know, some extremist group. I mean, he just looks like a big, you know, tough guy. So anyway, me and this other brother, we were talking, and I, you know, as we were talking to this guy, who he was a Jewish man, he started crying. The other da'i with me started crying, and when he started crying, I started crying. I'd never met this person before, this Jewish man. I'd never met him before. But the very fact that he saw us as Muslims, and he said, I am dying of cancer, I only have a few months to live, I cannot even do chemotherapy, what shall I do with my life? Desperate. Just made us feel so ungrateful for what we have. How short this life is. Now that conversation ended with him exchanging details with us. Inshallah, we're going to take him to one of the masjids in Toronto. And he is somebody who, inshallah, I hope, and by all the signs that I've seen so far, very, very positive, he may accept Islam. We don't know, but at least on the minimum, he got the message of Islam. So we need to remember, it is our duty as Muslims to convey the message of Islam. And what we need to understand is, when we are conveying the message of Islam, we have to understand who we are conveying to. So in the case of this Jewish man, we knew the Jewish scriptures. We knew, not the Jewish scriptures, we knew the scriptures of the Jewish people. We knew the Torah. So for example, we pointed out, for example, it says this in your particular scripture, or pointing out similarities and pointing out the fact that Musa alayhi salam is mentioned more than anyone else in the Quran. Things like this. But what I want us to do today, briefly, is to understand that when we look at all these religions, and we need to look at them from the perspective of how to convey Islam to them, we need to also understand that there is a new religion on the horizon which isn't really considered a religion. But I'm going to be putting forth an argument today that it is a religion. Some of you may agree or disagree with that. We can go over that in the Q&A. But in this presentation, what I actually want to cover is this. Facing the challenge of what's known as evolutionary humanism. I'm going to explain what that term means later. Evolutionary humanism, for us as Muslims to challenge this particular system, we need to first show that it is actually a religion. And this is actually not difficult to do. And this, as we're going to go on and see, there's abundant evidence for this. Secondly, we need to show that nothing in evolutionary theory has anything to do with atheism. Because this is one of the central tenets of evolutionary humanism, and we need to dismantle that. And thirdly, we need to show, and by the way, the first two is a way of challenging it, even if it was true. And the last one is a way of showing that it is not absolutely true. Okay, how many of you guys have seen this image before? Or something like this. There's a young man with a jacket. Pretty much everyone's seen this particular image. Now, I would say this image is as popular as Coca-Cola's red and white sort of stripy language, right? If you know nothing about evolutionary biology at all, say you've barely passed your GCSEs or whatever, right? And you have no formal education beyond that. Chances are you've come across this particular icon. Now, the reason why I wanted to cover this first is to show you the difference, which I'm going to be covering throughout the presentation, of the public understanding of Darwin's theory and the way it is actually academically understood. So the public understanding and the academic understanding, there's a big difference between these two. And this particular iconic image, although this is engraved in the minds of billions of people, and this is, if anything, is as close to an icon of Darwinism as we could get, according to mainstream philosophers of science, philosophers of biology, mainstream evolutionary biologists, some of whom propose Darwinism, some of whom oppose Darwinism, this image is false. Now I just want you to think about that for a second. Before I go into the reasons why, I just want you to consider something. Assuming what I'm saying is correct based upon what they are saying, what does that tell you? The fact that there's an image in your head, an image which you've probably seen in documentaries and maybe read in books and whatnot, which is in the minds of millions of people, if this image is false, it goes to show just how many other things must be false about this particular theory, which is proposed at a public level, but an academic level it is not understood in that particular way. And as we're going to be going through this presentation, I'm going to be explaining why this particular image is incorrect. But just to give you a few summary points. Firstly, you could reverse this image entirely. So what you could do is you could put the human being at the beginning, and you could make a line going down to like an ape-like ancestor, ape-like descendant. If you reverse it in that way, it would make no difference. It would literally make no difference. Secondly, going back, when we get back to that initial chimpanzee-like creature, no one knows what that looked like. We have absolutely no idea. In fact, and again, as I'm going to be going through this presentation, I'm going to be repeating the same problem again and again, which is the public understanding and the academic understanding. When we look at evolutionary biology, we're most likely to associate that field with people like the evolutionary icon, Richard Dawkins of Oxford University. But if you actually look at the field and you actually study it at an academic level, you come to realize actually that this person does not represent the views of the mainstream majority, and he is seen as a relative lightweight in the field. So, for example, for someone to be classified as a scientist, they have to do lab work. Essentially, they have to actually produce new knowledge. Now imagine if I have a PhD in, say, quantum mechanics, and I decide to become a postman. Nothing wrong with being a postman, but let's say I decide to become a postman. Does that qualify me as a scientist? Not really, because I just got a formal education and now I'm actually working as a postman. Likewise, if I was to go on to university and teach the same thing which I actually learned in my PhD, again, that would not qualify for me to be strictly a scientist. A scientist has to produce new knowledge. And in terms of that description of a scientist, a very strictly academic term, then Richard Dawkins certainly is not a scientist. In fact, there was a discussion going on between someone who is a scientist, E.O. Wilson. He is the father of a subfield in biology known as sociobiology. And he came up with this. He was proposing. He didn't come up with it. He was pushing forth an old theory known as group selection. And Richard Dawkins subscribes to this idea known as the selfish gene. And they were going back and forth online and offline about this. And on BBC Newsnight, E.O. Wilson had an interview. And in the interview, someone said, well, you have this view, but, Richard Dawkins disagrees with you. E.O. Wilson said, well, my disagreement is really with scientists in the field, and Richard Dawkins is a science journalist, and I don't really see why I have a disagreement with him. Now when I saw that, I was initially very shocked, because my own impression also was, before studying this academically, that this guy was a really big person in the field. Now, as we're going to go on in this presentation, you're going to see one by one the public understanding and the academic understanding, the differences between the two, not only in terms of who represents them, but in terms of their theories and the certainty that's ascribed to different versions of them. Now, the first thing that I said we're going to cover is why Darwinian evolution is a religion. Now, please forgive me if there's any technical term that you don't understand in this particular lecture. We can ask that during Q&A. All I want you to understand is the structure of what I'm saying. To face evolutionary humanism as the Muslim community, we need to show it's a religion, we need to show it's not absolute, and we also need to, I actually forgot what the point was, yes, not showing it has nothing to do with atheism, the second point. So, to understand why evolutionary humanism, or Darwinism as it's known, is important, is when you read the works of, say for example, Richard Dawkins in his book The Blind Watchmaker, where he says, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Now I want you to just think about those words for a second. And just try and replace those words with something else. So, Einstein's theory of relativity made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. It doesn't really flow that well. Niels Bohr's quantum mechanics model made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Again, it doesn't really work. Plate tectonics, as you can see, you can just keep inserting more and more. It doesn't really make sense that a scientific theory should make you intellectually fulfilled to be an atheist. Now I'm going to explain why that is the case later, but I just want to leave that out there just to show that there is an emotional, philosophical connection why certain people ascribe to this particular theory. And what I mean by ascribe to it is, I believe it to be a valid scientific theory, and I think all Muslims should, and I think everyone should, because I'm not saying it's invalid scientifically, but to believe that this is certain, this is a way of life, and this will give you even meaning in life. This is actually going way beyond the evidence. Now, another atheist biologist, Yuval Noah Harari, he puts it this way in his famous book Sapiens. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. Now, all he's done there is he's taken the logical implications of Darwinism and he's just moved them on into ethics and morality. And you can start to see how this can develop into an entire system. There's a picture of Leonard Darwin. Leonard Darwin was the son of Charles Darwin, and he understood this theory in absolute terms, and he knew that this theory means that some human groups are greater than others. And the Nazis took the teachings of Darwin to their logical implications. So even secular mainstream academics recognize that what the Nazis were doing at the time was just using Darwin's theory to justify their particular worldview. And there was a dovetailing between Nazism and Darwinism. Likewise, secular historians also point out that Darwin's theory initially in 1859, when it took off, one of the reasons it took off was because it dovetailed with the British Empire and it dovetailed with capitalism. So you can start to see that this is not just a scientific theory. You can start to see actually there's a bunch of things actually going on here. And Darwin used his theory to explain political phenomena. So for example, at the time, at the moment, in the media we Muslims are in the limelight. We are seen as the enemy. Now at the time of Darwin, like in our times now, the Ottomans, the Muslims were the enemy. And when the Ottomans were battling the Europeans at the in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, there was a battle that took place. And this was during Darwin's lifetime. And during this battle, the Ottomans lost against the Western European powers. And what Darwin basically said in response to the Ottomans losing this battle is he said, the civilized races have beaten the savage Turks hollow. right? So he was explaining the natural selection, his theory, and showing that and explaining that the civilized races, which was for him the Caucasians, they were beating the Turks because the Turks themselves were subhuman. They were actually savage. And in The Descent of Man, which is one of the lesser known works of Darwin compared to how famous Origin of Species is, he makes this clear. He says, in the future, the civilized races, the Caucasian races, they will wipe out the savage races. Now, to be fair, Darwin didn't encourage this. He merely made this as a point of scientific observation, that this is actually something that's actually going to happen. Now, Leonard, in his tradition, he carried on with this, and he said, of all the problems we're going to have to face in the future, in my opinion, the most difficult will be those concerning the treatment of the inferior races of mankind. And around that period, we did have things such as human zoos, where subhuman species, as they were thought of, Africans, Native Americans, Native Australians, were actually put into human zoos and put into exhibits and studied scientifically. In fact, some of them were studied to a point where they were linked to be missing links between the Caucasians and the African apes, that certain groups of Africans were seen as half human and half ape, if you like. Now, the political and ethical implications of this theory, there's a type of positive feedback loop. So number one, there was already a survival of the fittest type of thinking in capitalism, which is actually where Darwin got his idea from Thomas Malthus. And Darwinian evolution then provided a reinforcement of that thinking, and this created a type of positive feedback loop. Now, I want us to understand that we need to understand this phenomena as a religious, political, and ethical system before we understand how we can actually tackle it. And one of the things this will also go on to explain is why there is so much propaganda, why there is so much misinformation. Because one of the things which a lot of people find very disturbing, in fact, even atheist evolutionary biologists have spoken about this, which I'm going to be going over later, is how certain overzealous Darwinists, not all of them, certain overzealous Darwinists have gone to the level of creating mass level propaganda to show the public from their perspective that this is the way forward, this is the truth. Now, going back all the way to the early 20th century, we had the Piltdown Man hoax. Now, the Piltdown Man was seen as a missing link between human beings and our ape-like ancestors. And this was discovered in the UK, it was put on exhibit, it was used as evidence for decades. And later on it was discovered that this was actually a forgery, and this was a hoax which managed to persuade the scientific community writ large, including the Royal Society, including all of the most prestigious journals in the world. Now, what was interesting about the Piltdown phenomena, the Piltdown forgery phenomena, is not that it was fake. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is the way that one fossil, which even if it happened, even if it was the case that it was not fake, even if it was the case that it was real, at best it will still be trivial. At best. Because it's not the same as me digging up, Winston Churchill's body or whatever, right? And then saying, wow, look, that is him, look, it matches his bones, right? Or us watching like CSI and, discovering, okay, this is the murder weapon, this is the DNA, so this must be the culprit. Piltdown Man, even if it was true, it would still be trivial, because the assumptions behind that fossil being a human ancestor were multiple. And we're going to be going over some of the assumptions later. But even if it was true, it would have been trivial. And even today, as late as the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, Darwinus, otherwise known as IDA, which was the ultimate missing link in 2009. This was pushed all over the world. National Geographic did specials about this. David Attenborough did a documentary about this. There was so much commotion about this particular fossil. And then just a few months later, in a journal somewhere published, the scientific community is like, this doesn't really tell us anything interesting about human evolution. Yet till today, you can still go to Amazon, you can still get the book, you can still watch the documentary. So this mass level propaganda, which has been going on for decades, and this is not something which I just made up, this is something which has been recorded and attested to by secular mainstream academics. And this propaganda just doesn't exist in the if you like, the public, the how should you say it, in public communication. It's also within the education system. Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Darwin, he drew these fake embryo drawings, and these drawings were used for almost 100 years, all the way up to close to the year 2000, just at the turn of the century. These drawings were actually used, although they were known to be forgeries for decades. What's interesting is, even if they weren't forgeries, even if they were not forgeries, even if those embryos, those vertebrate embryos, were what they were described to be, it still wouldn't mean what they were trying to show they actually meant. Now, just to close off the section about Darwinism as religion, Darwinian evolution as religion, we really need to understand that Darwinian evolution or evolutionary humanism as a religion is not debatable. It may be debatable and I've heard people talk about this, how can you call it a religion? They don't believe in God, but religion means more than that, right? Religion, Buddhism is a religion, although they don't have a conventional, traditional concept of God. Communism is described as a religion, although it doesn't have a concept of God, but they've deified, say, Stalin, right? Now, what I want us to understand is secular, mainstream, evolutionary biologists who are pro-Darwin, pro-Darwinism and anti-Darwinism, both of them have spoken about how this particular theory has morphed into a full-out religion. A recent book published by Michael Roos, he's an atheist academic, a philosopher of science. He writes extensively in defense of Darwinism, because he does actually believe in it. And he's published this book with Oxford University called Darwinism as Religion. And if you think, the cover's deceptive in some way, purchase the book and have a read. He speaks about, from the very beginning, Darwinian evolution, Darwinism, was seen as a full-out alternative to Christianity. And this man on the left is very important. This is Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. Julian Huxley was an evolutionary biologist and an atheist and a philosopher. And he is the first one to categorically argue, although he was a Darwinist, although he was pro-Darwin, to categorically argue that evolutionary humanism or Darwinism is a religion, and it does have something to say about the way we need to live our lives, and we do actually need to evangelize to others. Now, this isn't just some fringe scientist working somewhere in his lab in Yorkshire or wherever. This was a very important, very influential man. He was the first president of UNESCO. The first president of UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. If you like, that is like an administrative role for global education. So he was the first president of that. And imagine that, the first president of such a prestigious educational institute is somebody who is a militant atheist who mocks God in his books. And he is somebody who believes evolutionary humanism is a religion, and he believes it has something to tell us about the meaning of life, and he believes this is something which has to be evangelized across the world. Now that goes to show, and this goes back to obviously the 1950s or 60s, whenever UNESCO was set up. Now that just goes to show you that there is a huge power structure behind this theory. I mean, if we were to try and unravel this sort of power structure, the religious, political, ethical, moral implications of string theory, we'd probably, not even write half a page. We won't get very far. But when it comes to this particular theory, it's oceans of information out there. And this isn't from people who disagree with it. This is from people who actually agree with it. And they're actually very open about their agendas. Now, another implication, apart from the propaganda and apart from the political and the other sort of implications of the theory, is that within academia there is a restriction to thinking outside of the box. So when it comes to, say, a particular theory like general relativity or quantum mechanics, general relativity and quantum mechanics, they are both theories which at a fundamental level contradict each other. Now you may not understand all the physics behind that, but as a conceptual point you understand that. But as a scientist, you're free to try and come up with something like quantum gravity, try and merge the two, try and maybe challenge this or whatever. But within academia, secular, mainstream, atheist, evolutionary biologists have complained about how they cannot get a word in terms of challenging Darwinian evolution. Masayoshi Nai, he's a Japanese evolutionary biologist, again, mainstream atheist biologist. He doesn't believe in Darwinian evolution. He has his own alternative model of evolution. Because remember, evolution and Darwinism are two different things. Now, Masayoshi Nai, he basically speaks about this in an interview, and he says, Darwin, in our field, is a god. And you cannot challenge this god. And this particular theory has become dogmatic, and when anything becomes dogmatic, you need to challenge it. And he is not some fringe scientist. If you go to any library in the world, even here Cambridge Library, even if you go to any library in the world, get a book, any book, and I'm doing this as a challenge, get any book on evolutionary biology at a university level, and you are going to come across his name. Nye's formula is known as, right? He is a big figure in population genetics. Yet, he has opinions like this. Now that really goes to show you how different this is to any other scientific theory that we've had in the history of science. Now on the top there, we have Lynn Margulis. She was again an extremely important evolutionary biologist. Mainstream, secular, atheist. She proposed her theory of end symbiosis, and this theory of end symbiosis, this is taught again, and I'm going to put out the challenge again. Go to any university in the world, pick up any book, university level book on evolutionary biology, and you're going to come across her theory. It's impossible to study evolutionary biology at a university level, except that you're going to come across her theory. And again, she didn't believe in Darwinian evolution, she believed in her own theory. And what she proposed is this. What she says about the theory is this. She says, history will remember Neo-Darwinism as an Anglo-Saxon religion. That's quite a statement. And if you really think about it, why would somebody go to that length of using those sort of derogatory terms for this sort of field? And it'll just go to show you the sort of emotions that exist amongst even academics about this particular theory. And she won the National Medal of Science in America. And like I said, look her up, Google her. She passed away a few years ago, but very important evolutionary biologist. On the bottom there, James Shapiro, again, very important evolutionary biologist, published great works, and he's again not a believer in God. he speaks out against intelligent design, creationism, and stuff like that. And again, he has set up his own project called the Third Way of Evolution, where evolutionary biologists from across the world get together, from Europe, from China, from America, from MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge. They get together. And they get together to discuss a third way of evolution, not intelligent design, not creationism, not neo-Darwinism either. Now, there is academic restriction when it comes to this particular theory. And the number of biologists who speak out against Darwinism and actively oppose it, as opposed to the ones who just accept it and just go with the flow, I mean, you can't really do a comparison. The overwhelming majority of biologists subscribe to the theory, and what we have to remember is that within the field of evolutionary biology, biologists aren't sitting around conspiring, how do we get religious people to stop believing in God? How do we get religious people to believe in human chimp ancestry? They're not doing that. I've visited evolutionary biologists, I've communicated with them, any of us can do so. The average evolutionary biologist is working on medicines to save lives. That's it. Historical accounts of the origin of life, historical accounts of human chimp ancestry, theological questions, mixing them with biology. This is really the work of a fringe group of evolutionary biologists who come out in the public light, and they try and use their credentials to do these things. The vast majority of them, they're indifferent to the topics that we're actually speaking about currently. Now, remember I said the first thing is that we need to understand evolutionary humanism as a religion in order to challenge it. So that section is over. This is the second section. And this is actually going to be the briefest because it's very, very simple to actually cover. Now, evolutionary biology has been used as a weapon against belief, against faith, against religion. Richard Dawkins' very popular book, The God Delusion, in fact makes it a central point in the central argument of the book. So it's quite a big book, but overall he summarizes the book in his central argument. And in this central argument, he basically says that Darwinian evolution has shown that design is an illusion. So his central point in that book is basically that Darwinism does away with God. Now, Darwinian evolution has absolutely nothing to do with atheism. Now, at first that's going to surprise you, because you're going to think to yourself, no, that's not true, because I know people who are, or they drifted away from religion, or they say they are atheists and they point to this theory. So what you're saying can't be true. I acknowledge that. So I'm being very careful with my words. Darwinian evolution has nothing to do with atheism. Okay? Yes, there may be atheists who say this theory has something to do with them. Yes, there may be people in the world who say we will not believe in God because we have this theory. That I'm not challenging that. That's obvious. That's what's going on. What I'm saying is there is nothing within the theory itself, Darwinian conception or another conception of evolutionary theory, as proposed by Charles Darwin, which entails the disbelief in God. Does anyone understand the difference between the two? We're going to go over this in the Q&A. Even Charles Darwin realized this himself. Charles Darwin was firstly a Christian, then he left his belief in Christianity, and he became a deist. He just believed in God, but no religion. He didn't believe God interfered with the world. And in the last decade of his life, way after the publication of The Origin of Species, in the last decade of his life, he became an agnostic. And one of the things which led him to agnosticism was the problem of suffering, the problem of evil. It didn't make sense to him. And he was always unhappy with Christianity's conception of evil. So he himself, number one, was never an atheist. He was never an atheist. Two, he was a deist at the time he published The Origin of Species. Now, of course, there's some debate amongst his biographers about when he left this or when he became agnostic. Putting those things aside, one thing that no biographer of his will disagree with: nothing in his theory, according to him, would lead someone to disbelieve in God. In fact, in a letter which he wrote to someone, which you can actually get on the Darwin Correspondence Project, he actually says this: it seems to be absurd to doubt that a man can be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. Now, people always try and use these ad hoc sort of explanations. Or what it was is that he was under a lot of pressure, that's why he was making these comments. Well, no, this was actually a private letter that he wrote to someone. In fact, Charles Lyell, who's a prominent figure in the church, he wrote a review of The Origin of Species, and in that review he basically said that this conception that instead of species not changing, that there was an original creation and that original creation developed over time, this is just as noble as a creative activity for God as initial creation. Okay, so let me just repeat those words. What he's basically saying is this: whether you believe there's an initial creation and that develops, or whether you believe there's multiple creations which are species which don't change, they're both noble in terms of their conception. So even this conception of the tree of things evolving from one common ancestor, one universal common ancestor, is just as noble for God. Charles Darwin was so impressed with this review that he actually put it inside his second edition of The Origin of Species. So you can clearly see in his public discourse and in his private discourse, he did not see anything in his theory which would lead to the disbelief in God. Okay, the last section. So we've covered, to face the challenge of evolutionary humanism, we need to understand it's a religion. 2, we need to understand it has nothing to do with atheism. And 3, we need to understand it is not absolute. So this is the part about it's not absolute. And I'll be finishing on this, and then we'll go on to the Q&A, inshallah. So first thing about science, what we need to understand is this: nothing in science is absolute. I don't mean, we know the shape of the earth, that's not going to change. No, science is more than that. Science is taking observations and making theories. Okay? So, nothing in science is absolute. Science doesn't mean observations. Science means theories based on observations, theories based on inference, theories which are tested. Okay? So, I'm a scientist, say, and I want to know what color swans are. So I notice all the swans I've seen so far are white, and say I've seen 1,000 swans. And after seeing 1,000 swans, I come up with a general theory: all swans are white. Now this general theory can be challenged in the future because we might come across a black swan. Now a black swan would be a total challenge to my theory. This black swan problem, or as it's known, the problem of induction, is understood at an academic level, which is why no scientific theory, no Darwinism, no general relativity, no quantum mechanics, nothing, no string theory, is absolute. And scientists will not speak about them in absolute terms. Even the most famous proponent of Darwinian evolution, Richard Dawkins himself, in his book A Devil's Chaplain, this is what he says: we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. So this is not something which I've just taken out of thin air. This is a well understood thing. Any book you pick up on the philosophy of science will say something to the effect of no scientific theory can be absolute. You can always get new data which can challenge your previous theory. Secondly, if you imagine these blue dots are the observations that you've actually seen. So for example, you've observed that the crocodile has this particular length tail. You've observed that this particular chemical is present in this particular bacteria. Certain observations, the shape of the earth, whatever you want to call it. Now these observations are obviously not going to change. These observations are obviously absolute in the sense that we know that they are true. Right? No one's disputing with that. But science takes those observations and it makes an inference based upon those observations. Now you have this graph with all these dots. Now if I was to ask you to make a line of best fit, or a line that you think fits best, in this particular graph, some of you may draw a straight line. Some of you may draw a curve. Some of you may draw a sine curve. Right? Do you guys get the point? The same observations can give rise to multiple theories. And this is extremely important in science because any scientific theory has an alternative, even if you cannot conceive of it at the time. This is what philosophers of science say. Even if you can't think of an alternative, it doesn't mean there is no alternative. Charles Darwin, he actually understood this, and he actually spoke about this in The Origin of Species. He says, I am well aware, this is right at the beginning of the book, mind you, I am well aware that there is scarcely a point discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts on both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be done here. Now Charles Darwin, he goes on to explain why he believes his theory is the best explanation of the data that we actually have. He does that in The Origin of Species. I'm not denying he does that. But what he does do in the beginning of the book, and he did understand the philosophy of science. Obviously the philosophy of science wasn't as well developed as it is now, but he had an understanding of its core concepts. He understood the same observations can give rise to alternative theories. He understood that. And so how can a scientific theory be true literally if one, observations can come that can challenge it in the future, two, the same observations can give rise to multiple different theories. And within evolutionary biology there's been at least, I know of at least 5 evolutionary alternatives to Darwinian evolution which exist within the field right now. Some in the past have been discarded, but 5 alternatives exist right now which are proposed by atheist evolutionary biologists as a counter to Darwinian evolution. So how can it be absolute if you have 5 alternatives to the theory? Lastly, there is the issue of theory-ladenness of observation. What that basically means is this. The way we're usually taught science is you take observations and then you come up with a theory or a hypothesis, then you test it, and it's seen as objective. Well, it's not really that simple. The problem is that you have to have a hypothesis or a theory before you actually go out and observe. And if you already have those lenses on, then you're going to have confirmation bias, and you're going to look for those things which actually fit the theory. That's just a human thing to do. So this problem of theory-ladenness of observation, this challenges the objectivity of any particular scientific theory. And Charles Darwin pointed this out himself. He basically said, the whole idea of, doing observations and then coming up with a theory and not having a hypothesis, he said, well, you might as well go to a quarry and just pick up pebbles and count them, right? It's a useless activity. You are bound to have a theory before you look for observation, and the fact is, in the world there is an infinite amount of data, and if you have a theory, you can make certain data fit your theory. Now, I'm not saying that makes all scientific theories equally subjective, right? Which is the idea, some of the ideas proposed by some philosophers who go a bit wild in their thinking. I'm not saying, of course science is a good method to discover things about the world, but these 3 things we shouldn't ignore. Confirmation, theory-ladenness of observation, undetermination of theory by evidence, and also the problem of induction. Now, lastly, I'm just going to be going over some assumptions which exist within Darwinian evolution. Now, if you don't understand some of these, if you didn't understand some of the things I said previously, you can just ask those questions during the Q&A. So firstly, every single thing has to be explained naturalistically in science. This is known as methodological naturalism. This is not a bad thing. Natural effects have natural causes scientifically. So from a scientific perspective, to speak about the soul would be non-scientific. You cannot speak about the soul. And you cannot speak about the mind from an abstract perspective. Everything is broken down into physical terms, which is why, even according to mainstream evolutionary biologists, even if there was no fossils, something like the human chimpanzee ancestry would be true as a matter of logic. This is something which is not disagreed upon. So even if there was no fossils, even if we didn't have DNA, even if we didn't have genetics, even if we didn't have those things, something like the tree of life, something like human chimpanzee ancestry would be true as a matter of logic because of methodological naturalism. Which is why this particular image is going to strike you as really strange, but I want you to hold on for a second, right? That looks really strange. That looks like something of a cartoon. But I want you to understand something. From a methodological naturalistic view, anything can slide into anything else. So, the idea that you have a human-like ancestor, a chimp-like ancestor sliding into a human being, that is theoretically possible. But it is also theoretically possible that you have no chimpanzees and chimpanzees do not exist at all, and you have a pig-like creature which over millions of years evolves into a Homo sapien. Theoretically that is possible. And if you think this is ludicrous, just pick up, it's actually published by, I should mention it here because it's actually published by Cambridge University, a book called Philosophy of Human Evolution, and in that it speaks about this particular plasticity problem. That book is written by Michael Roos. That classification itself is sort of arbitrary because anything can slide into anything else, and this is because of the assumption of methodological naturalism. Secondly, there's the assumption of homology. Homology is the idea that similarities are due to common descent. So look at the similarity between this human being, look at the similarity between this chimpanzee, look at their elbows, look at their skulls, they must have a common ancestor. Well, the first thing to know is that is not an observation of nature, that is an assumption. Okay? And this is very, very important to understand because many times we are told these things as if they're an observation. They are not. They are an assumption. Secondly, we know of a counterexample to the assumption of homology, which is known as homoplasy. So in that same book which I just mentioned, you'll find this image. This is a marsupial saber-toothed cat and a placental saber-toothed cat. Now looking at those two cats, you're instantly going to be tempted to say common ancestry. But that is not due to common ancestry. That is homoplasy, the opposite of homology. One of these cats is from North America, one is from South America. They're not the same species, they cannot breed, right? And they're actually geographically separated. So this is sometimes also known as convergent evolution. Lastly, the tree of life is also an assumption. It's not a fact of nature. And some evolutionary biologists challenge the tree by proposing the web of life, the bush of life, the hedge of life, and so on. But we need to understand that the tree of life is pushed as a observation. We've seen it, here you go. No, actually, it is a assumption which is governing Darwinian evolution. Lastly, if you imagine the history of Darwinism or the history of any change of species is a bridge, is, if you like, the road of the bridge. And the foundations is the mechanism. So we have a mechanism and we have a history. The history of the tree of life, the mechanism is natural selection. If the mechanism fails, the history fails. You can show all the similarities between the human being and anything else, but if the mechanism is questionable, then the history is questionable. Now I'm just going to finish on this point. The origin of species did not come up with the idea of the tree of life. The tree of life goes back to the ancient Brahmins. It goes back 3,000 years. It's an ancient idea. The only reason why the idea of the tree of life was taken seriously is because Darwin showed how it could work by the process of natural selection. Now I want you to just understand one conceptual point which I started off in the beginning. The public understanding of Darwin's theory and the academic understanding. Now the public understanding is quite simple. Darwin solved it, he worked it out, it's all good, it's true. That's pretty much it. It's as true as the shape of the earth, in the words of Victor Stenger, an atheist evangelist. It's as true as the shape of the earth. Yet, I just want us to realize this. Something which is the core, if you take away natural selection, there is nothing else in the origin of species. What else is there? That's what it's about, natural selection. Something that we just take as granted as true. Last year in November, which is exactly a year from now, at the Royal Society, which is the oldest science society in the world, they got together with some of the most important evolutionary biologists alive today in this particular field, and guess what the central question was? Was Darwin's mechanism, is Darwin's mechanism working? Is it sufficient? One section saying, no it's not, we need alternatives, we need to revise evolutionary biology. The other school, the orthodox Darwinian school, saying no, holding to their guns and saying no, it's going to work, don't worry about it. I just want you to think about that for a second. The central mechanism, which is taught in universities, in documentaries, in all these places, and you cannot escape hearing things like survival of the fittest. Here's an evolutionary explanation for this. Here's that. The central point of the origin of species is still being discussed by atheist evolutionary biologists. And by the way, I'm going to emphasize this again, the fringe, right? There's still a small minority. They're still questioning if it is valid, if it even works. That just goes to show the huge difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. Now, to begin off with, I started off with the story of the Jewish man who I met this week, who was speaking to him about Islam, and he said about his cancer and him passing away. I want to ask all of you to consider something. We are here as Muslims, as successors of who? The prophets. There are going to be no other prophets which are going to come to this earth. New prophets. It is our duty to convey the message of Islam to every section of society. So whether it's the Baha'i community, the Jewish community, the Christian community, we need to understand how to convey Islam to them. It is our duty to convey Islam to them. And it would be a breach of duty. It would be a violation of duty if we are to go and speak to people, yet we have no idea what they believe. We have no idea what their beliefs are based upon. What we need to understand is, just like as the Muslim community, we have dedicated training, dedicated seminars to learn how to convey the message of Islam to Christians, to Jews, to other faiths. We need this as well with evolutionary humanism. We need this as well with Darwinism, because this has become into a social phenomenon, into a religion. You can test this out yourself. If you speak to somebody who say they're an atheist and they do actually believe in this theory, you just speak to them and you speak to them about it, chances are, and I'm just putting this out there, chances are more than 90% of the time they have absolutely no idea about the sciences. They have absolutely no idea about the assumptions. They have absolutely no idea about the differences or the fact that it's based on a probabilistic framework. They have no idea about any of this, but they believe in it. And I just want to end upon a conversation I had with one of our du'at, who he used to be a militant atheist for 15 years. He did not believe in God. He was from an Irish background, Christian background. He left that, and he was living as a total atheist. Not, I'm not sure there's a God, but as a total atheist. And just a few years ago, alhamdulillah, Allah guided him, he became Muslim. But I asked him an important question, because he was one of these guys who, not like the general public, they just go along with what they hear, everyone's following this thing, so let's follow it too. Everyone's saying it's true, so it must be true. He is someone that always questioned and always looked into it. So I said to him, didn't you look into this theory when you were an atheist? And what did you think about it? He said, I looked into it and it didn't make sense to me. But I followed it anyway because I wanted to follow my desires. And an atheist, he was just frank. He said, this is what I did. And I want us to understand that we have this knowledge, but chances are the people we're going to speak to are not going to understand that. I'm not even going to know this stuff. Which goes to show you how much of a social phenomena it actually is. And one of the things we also have to do then is we need to show them a very basic principle from the Quran. A very powerful principle if you actually think about it. Human beings only do things for 3 reasons, if you really break it down. Number 1, they do things because they desire to do those things. They do things because they desire to do those things. 2, they do things because that is what their ancestors were doing or what society is doing. They may not even like it, but they are doing that because everybody else is doing that. There's a social pressure. Or 3, they use their mind, they use their reason to arrive at what is true. Whether they like it or not, whether the society accepts it or not. Okay, these 3 possibilities. Your desires, following society, or using your intellect. What does the Quran propose humanity does? Again and again, Allah says, do they not think? Do they not reflect? Do they not use their reason? Do they not use their mind? This is a book for this, as in Allah says, the people of understanding. The people who reflect about the creation of the heavens and earth. So what we need to understand is we need to give people a paradigm shift in their thinking, to break away from social conformity, to break away from the imprisonment of your own desires, of just doing what you like. And we need to call people back to the central reason that they were created, and that central reason that they were created, according to Darwinists, is what? This is in the selfish gene. This is almost like a religious sermon, right? There is no higher, the highest rationale is to survive and reproduce. I'm paraphrasing here, but the highest rationale, the reason why we exist, is to survive and reproduce, right? That is the highest meaning of life, essentially. So we're no different, essentially, from a bacteria on the back of a rotting dead goat. Because that survives and that reproduces. We survive, we reproduce. Break down everything we do. Why do we get PhDs? Well, because we want to survive. Why do we buy our wives flowers? Because we want to reproduce. Essentially, that's what it is. But Islam comes along and says, no. Sorry, no. That is not the highest rationale of your existence. The highest reason for which you were created is to worship the Creator. This is the reason why you are created. And this alternative view that you actually have makes you no different from an animal. In fact, even animals, we as Muslims believe everything within creation worships Allah. So you cannot even use that analogy, not even like an animal. We need to call people back to Allah, and we need to understand that it is our duty to convey the message of Islam to humanity. Everything good I have said is from Allah, every mistake is from myself. Jazakallah khair for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
From a scientific point of view, I find it really difficult to accept the idea that from a theoretical point of view that one species can develop into another species, like chimpanzee develop into human or pig develop into humans, because every species has a fixed number of chromosomes and they always have that fixed number, and the species has totally different numbers. So human will always produce animals. Human will always produce humans. Pig will produce pig. So how you could at one stage develop into another species?
Okay.
This is I really
Okay. The thing is, I'm just going to repeat your question for everybody. Yeah. You're asking. You don't understand how scientifically one species can turn into another, because it has certain fixed traits.
Yeah.
Scientifically, it can, under certain assumptions.
Can you give me an example?
Okay,
Can you say
I'll give you an example. So, we can say and I'm only paraphrasing
I'm talking
mainstream
about
academia, right? So, we aren't around for millions of years to watch one species turn into another. We're not around to watch that. But what we can do is, if we make certain assumptions, then we can have this as a valid scientific idea, but it doesn't mean it's absolute. One of the assumptions you can make is that random mutations are put together over millions of years and they are collected by natural selection, and that changes one species into another. Now you may say to me, we've never seen that. You may say to me, natural selection as a mechanism doesn't work. You may say to me, homology as an assumption is dubious, whatever. But I'm still, and I'm only playing the devil's advocate here, I'm still, as a scientist, I'm not wrong in holding the view that under these assumptions, it's plausible. And what we need to do as Muslims is, we're not challenging Darwinian evolution from a scientific perspective. Because at the end of the day, 100 years ago, the scientific theory which contradicted the Quran was the static state model. The static state model said the universe is eternal. The universe always existed and always will exist. Now this contradicts the Quran, because the Quran says the universe has a beginning. Now 100 years ago, what would we have done? Would we have tried to take on, because remember, this was a consensus amongst physicists pretty much, that the static state model describes the universe. What would we have done 100 years ago? Would we have tried to dismantle this theory scientifically? No. We would have said, you know what, this is a valid scientific theory, but scientific theories can change over time. Problem of induction, problem of undetermination or observation, all this. Plus, this particular, because remember, all scientific theories are based on certain assumptions. You can say to them, well, you have certain assumptions involved there too. It's not absolute, but it's a plausible scientific idea. Let's leave it there. A few decades later, 1940s, that scientific view was, that ijma, that consensus was overturned, and we had the Big Bang model, which is in line with the Quran. 100 years from now, maybe they'll drop the Big Bang and they'll go back to the steady state model. Us as Muslims, we don't need to go down to the detail and challenge these ideas scientifically. All we need to show is they're not absolute, and all we need to show is that this particular idea has nothing to do with the non-existence of God. In my experience, and I'm not saying that my experience is the truth, but in my experience, I think it's a distraction to get involved in the technicalities. Even when I sometimes meet people on the street when conveying the message of Islam, someone says, I don't believe in God, I believe in Darwin's theory. I can give him all this information, but I don't. I don't think it's important. I think it's important to show him point number 2, which is, this theory has absolutely nothing to do with atheism. Because at the end of the day, we're there to call to Allah. Even if he believes in human chimp ancestry, let him. Eventually, if he starts to believe in God after the conversation, then we call him to the Quran and say, then he disagrees with this, then we can go into more details. But getting involved in the nitty-gritty scientific things, is this possible, is that possible? I would say it's a distraction, because we have a particular message we're trying to get across. So that's what I would do. Yes. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Bhai. I haven't seen you for years.
Alhamdulillah, good. Jazakumullah khair. Just to add to your point, I just want to suggest something. There's a very nice book called The Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. And in that one, he, in a very, not a simple way, but in a very understandable way, explains what science is, what scientific theories are, what scientific discoveries are. And he mentions one interesting thing. He said that any scientific theory is only in the head of that person. It's not something that exists out there.
Yes.
Which is very important for us to understand. And second thing, he says that no scientific theory can be proven.
Yes.
So
absolutely. Let me just repeat the point Brother Faisal said. Very important point. Brief History of Time.
Yeah, Stephen
Hawking. He mentions that any scientific theory is not some external thing in the world. It's actually within your head, within the heads of the scientists, what they've constructed. 2, nothing is absolute. And this is very important to understand.
But if we want to rely upon quotations of Stephen Hawking, he also said in one of his interviews, he doesn't think that the universe requires God to exist.
Yes.
So just accepting an idea which is even given by a scientist is not an evidence or a proof, really.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So this is where we need to make a distinction. When Stephen Hawking says any scientific theory cannot be proven, he is saying the same thing that all philosophers of science agree about. He is making a general statement which is not a statement any philosopher of science will disagree about. But when he makes a particular point about God and his theory, that is his subjective view. And with any scientist, what we always have to do is this: not every statement of a scientist is a scientific statement. So if a scientist makes a statement, like he said, no scientific theory can be proven, this is a view which is resonated within, and there's a consensus upon this within philosophy of science. But when it comes to him saying the universe doesn't require God, this is where he's gone beyond his field of science, and he's talking about theology. Theology is a separate field, and there is no consensus among, and there isn't even a, if you like, a philosophy of theology. So you're absolutely right. We can't just take statements and say, yes, we agree with them, because somebody can take like a statement like you brought and say, what about this? So we need to be careful there. So whenever someone makes a statement, we always need to understand, is that statement a general understanding of the scientific or philosophical community, or is that his own idea? And in your case, the quote that you explained of his, that is his own idea. The universe doesn't need God.
Yeah, but as I'm sure you know, that once we go into the philosophical parts of describing things, they start getting very hazy.
Yeah, of course.
And very liquid-like thing. There's nothing solid. Even within talking about relativity, and when the scientists started looking at matter at the very minute, low level, they started talking about the uncertainty principle, and then they matched the existence of things with the observation. And you know the two theories even within science, and one of them, Einstein, is arguing with other scientists saying, look at the moon. Do you really believe that it exists because I'm looking at it? In other words, it became so philosophical, so bizarre, that they think that something exists just because you are, and it is related, its existence is related to the observation.
Yes.
And you know, from the very early days, there were many groups and thoughts and ideas. One of those groups was called the sophisticated Sophistiyin, even within Islamic history. And they had the idea that everything which is around us is imagination. There is no real existence for things. And that's why within Aqidah, within Islamic theology, one of the first statements that they start with is that the reality of the existence of things is real.
Absolutely, but not only this, we as Muslims, we don't take science within our creed. And this is very important to understand, because what starts to happen, like the brother said, science has these theories and some of them are so hazy and some of them are really out there. And what some Muslims do is, because they have an inferiority complex, because everyone's saying, this theory is true, they then try and take the Quran and they try and make it in line with Darwin's theory or something else. But the problem with that approach is, 100 years from now or 200 years from now, you'll have completely different theories in chemistry, physics and biology. Different theories. Because they're different to what they were 100 years ago, so of course they're going to be different to what we're going to have 100 years from now. And then what are we going to do again? Are we going to start changing all that stuff again? So, when it comes to the Quran and when it comes to our own belief as Muslims, we do not prove it using science. And this is a point which I also wanted to make. It is very dangerous to actually do that. Because how can you use something as a basis for your faith, which itself can change? And, as Imam Ghazali said, if somebody believes in Islam because of one abstract proof, well, what if someone comes along and changes that proof? What are you going to do? These are very, very important things for us to understand. But the main point which I wanted to get across today is that the public understanding is very different to the academic understanding. And this is something I hope I've gotten across, even if you didn't understand all the technical details and some of the terms.
However, just if you can give a comment upon this.
Sure.
Within the development of science and technology and things, Darwin at his time used whatever he knew, the available knowledge, in order to arrive at a particular theory. But it was not very late afterwards that many other things were discovered and they defied his theory. And I think not from the philosophical point of view, but from the pure scientific observational approach, that the Darwinism has completely collapsed.
Okay.
I would not hesitate, really. Of course, we can, maybe you have got a different opinion. But scientifically, Darwinism has completely collapsed for a number of reasons. One of the important reasons, there is no fossil record evidence for the theory at all. This couldn't have been proven even with a lot of people trying to make research upon this. Mendel's law in genetics were not known. They came afterwards. And they showed that species just go one after the other. In other words, they just reproduce. And you cannot have, like what Sheikh Abdullah was asking about, you cannot have something which emerges from something else. It has got to be from the same line. Those were known after Darwin, not at the time of Darwin. The discovery of the cell and the functions within the cell, we need to talk about just very simple and very understandable figures, was not known. Now with a lot of analysis within the microscopes, the huge microscopes, they found that the cell is a very complicated existence, very, very complicated. There are thousands of functions that are implemented within a cell. The discovery of the DNA, which is a complete code that tells the cell what to do and how to develop from one stage to the other, is fascinating, really. They tell you that within a spoonful of DNA, it can contain the information, not only encyclopedia, all of the books that have ever been written.
Yeah.
One cell has got, if you search the DNA within one cell, it extends to 7 feet or something like 2 meters. Within the human body, there is an estimated 100 trillion cells, which means that if you were to join those together, they would end up with the distance between the Earth and between the Sun 1,330 times. And you know that's very huge, because 150 million kilometers there is between the Earth and between the Sun.
Yep.
Even scientists have said, how did life initially emerge, even if we, for the sake of argument, accept that it is possible for something to jump from one thing to the other. But they tried in a number of experiments. They've done huge efforts about that. This theory is now abandoned, completely abandoned. They say we've got to give up trying to generate life from something which is just matter, non-living matter. So this has completely collapsed. The other thing is that
Okay, let me just make a point.
yeah, just two things, if you allow me, just two things, and then I'll. The other thing is that according to the theory, there should be some transitional versions of those living creatures that are there, which is not there, doesn't exist. The Cambrian, which has existed 530 million years ago, nowadays still it is in the form that it was before. In other words, it should be according to the theory, if something is developing, that should be able to see something which is in between. And that doesn't happen, doesn't exist. Therefore, a number of issues there, and you know that the whole of the theory has been abandoned, something which is called new Darwinism. Not Darwinism. In other words, even those who are very enthusiastic about Darwinism, scientifically, they said we cannot take Darwinism in the form that it was initially stated. It is going to be modified. So they are now defending what? A so-called new Darwinism, not the classical one, because it cannot be proven. Simply speaking, it cannot be proven.
Yes.
And there are a number of other very important issues, of
fine.
course, but I mean, very simple, in
Yeah.
very simple terms, it cannot stand. It
Okay.
doesn't exist.
This is where we need to be careful, because Darwinian evolution as a scientific theory, whether neo-Darwinism or Darwinism, we can use those terms interchangeably. From a scientific perspective, it's 100% valid, and I'll explain why. I agree with you, there's lots of disputes within the community. Without doubt, there's lots of disputes. There's disputes about the origin of life, there's disputes about transmutation, there's disputes, everything you've listed there, there's disputes about fossils and whatnot. But that doesn't mean it's not valid scientifically. Because any scientific theory, as long as it is something naturalistic, which has a naturalistic understanding in which you don't put in the soul, you don't put in the mind, you don't put in this, you don't put in that, and it is something which is generally agreed upon, you would still classify that as a valid scientific theory. So there are opponents, but I would say 99% of evolutionary biologists still believe evolution by natural selection, as Darwin proposed it, is right.
But as you mentioned, there are many.
There's problems. I agree.
And they're keeping them down.
Well,
They don't let them.
Well, the thing about science is this. For example, one of the assumptions of Darwinism is that things evolve gradually. Very, 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 very gradually. And like you pointed out, Sheikh, Cambrian explosion totally destroys the assumption of gradualism. It's gone. So what they did to repair that is they came up with another assumption of punctuated equilibrium. So you're right. In the problems that you're pointing out, you're right. But what I want to point out is that they use new assumptions to patch up the previous assumptions which fail.
But even he said in his book, in his 17th chapter, he said, my theory is going to collapse completely
If gradualism
it can be
fails.
proven so and so.
Yes.
And that has been proven so and
Yes,
so.
yes, yes.
So he has made evidence upon himself
Yeah.
that
So-
the theory has failed.
So what the Sheikh is speaking about is that Darwin said in The Origin of Species, if gradualism fails, my theory fails. Gradualism is agreed upon that as a history of life, gradualism is failed. It has failed. It's something that nobody disagrees with. Fossils turn up in places where they shouldn't turn up and whatnot. So evolution working gradually doesn't work, and he used this as a falsification test in his theory. But the evolutionary biologists today, they have replaced that assumption, and they've fixed that by adding a new assumption of punctuated equilibrium. So I'm not disagreeing with you that these problems exist, Sheikh. I totally agree with you. But we still cannot say it's not non-scientific, because the thing about science is this. You can change the assumptions and you can repair an old theory. As long as it's naturalistic, You can repair
I
it.
think they're struggling with this. If they want to really go on and try to prove it, I think they're struggling with it.
This is what the meeting was about last year, but I still, from what I've seen, 99% of biologists, they accept it blindly.
Many scientists are now lecturing so-called intelligent design. Yes,
Just
and
one point about that. Just want to bring it out that it's very interesting, the discussion which is going on. And again, coming back to the brief history of time, he mentions that there are two accepted theories. One is general theory of relativity of Einstein, and the other one is, as you mentioned, Niels Bohr's proposed quantum mechanics. And he says clearly, these both cannot be right at the same time. One, either both are wrong, or one is correct, one is wrong, or other is correct, other is wrong. Both cannot be right at the same time.
Yes.
But these are accepted as valid scientific theories because within that framework of big things, galaxies, stars, all these other big things in the cosmic level, Einstein theory of relativity works. And it doesn't work in quantum things, small things, where quantum mechanics work. So, the problem comes if we accept scientific theories as absolute, as you mentioned. But if they're relative, it works, it helps with the predictions, it helps with sending rockets or sending satellites, and it helps with the observations we have. Same with the Newton.
Yeah.
Newtonian mechanics is...
The thing which I want to highlight is that if you look at this diagram, you see any line of best fit that you draw will have predictive power,
Yes.
even if it's wrong.
Yeah.
So for example, I could draw a sine curve and you can draw a straight line. Both of us have predictive power. So a theory having predictive power doesn't really mean much.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely,
So
yes.
what we as Muslims need to do is we need to narrow down and focus on what our role is. Our role is not to disprove it scientifically.
Yeah.
Our role is simply to show it has nothing to do with atheism, because the first thing we're going to do is call to Allah. Two, we want to show people that it's not absolute. Anything beyond that, we don't need to do.
But
we just need to show it's not absolute.
As you mentioned at the beginning, and I agree with you, that this part of the philosophy is the important one.
Yes.
And that is, what are the consequences of such a thing?
Yes.
Within the time in which he generated his theory, it meant really, as a consequence, even if it's not stated within the theory itself, according to the Bible, human beings are created as they are and so on. So just introducing an idea that human beings have emerged from something else is going to simply contradict with the idea that is there within the Bible.
Of course.
So even if he's not stating such a thing, at the end it's like that. And this is why could be some other people have been very enthusiastic about it. And could be also the reason that when a person like Stephen Hawking says that the universe doesn't need God, this comes out in very bold titles and everybody is about it. However, they continue for 20 years or 30 years making discoveries and even putting lectures, and they keep repeating the same thing. Well, we discovered that things are more sophisticated than we originally thought. So what does this mean? It's more sophisticated than originally thought. They say it is not possible, according to the probability theory, it is not possible really. One of them, which is Fred Hoyle, he said that the probability of a species being generated like this is like the probability of a tornado coming across a scrapyard and assembling out of that a Boeing 747. How much is that? A tornado just goes across a scrapyard, and at the end you end up with a Boeing 747. It's ridiculous. It cannot be like that. Yes. At one stage, I came across the figure that they talked about the possibility of life emerging from a cell, statistically emerging from a cell, and they ended up with an estimation of 10 raised to the 223, which is to the 223 power. And as you know, that the universe is not more than
14-15 billion
years. Yeah, it is like 1.6 or 7 billion years, which means 10 to the 9. We're talking about 10 to the 9, not 10 to the 223. This is mathematically speaking. So even if we, it's not a matter of trying to prove that this is within the Quran. I'm not in line with this. But at least it can be seen that using very simple logic, there are certain things that are to be questioned. And those who have the answers, they have got to prove their claim.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, so they have to prove the claim.
Last question, and I'm going to finish.
So just a couple of points. So I think a very important point, which you may have touched upon, is kind of linked to the questions that's been asked around, is that in Islam, the concept of Darwinian evolution, with the exception of human beings, cannot be excluded. You know, it is possible. So Quran does not say that what do you say? A hippopotamus cannot come from a different animal. So I think it is very dangerous that we try and debate the whole concept of evolution in itself, in Darwinian evolution. So some kinds of evolution, for example, at a smaller scale, so for example, I work in cancer cells and I can clearly see what is perfectly Darwinian-like evolution happening when you give them different drugs. They evolve, you know, that's perfectly makes sense. And if I wasn't a Muslim, I would think that, you know, it's very logical to extrapolate what I see this into a higher level. But you have the point that you made, which is, this is, unlike experiments that I do, you cannot experiment across millions of years, and you cannot prove that, and it's absolutely possible that, you know, at a small scale, Darwinian evolution works, but it doesn't at a large scale. So I think for youngsters who are, who may not necessarily be very well versed with Islam, and who are Muslims in societies like ours, they're facing a big dilemma on who do I go to. You know, my science teacher and society tells me this, whereas if I go to people who are of religion, their blunt answer is this whole field is wrong, whereas I know that parts of it are very plausible. And I think the big danger is rejecting the whole concept of Darwinian evolution as completely wrong, that can never exist, and that completely alienates people like myself who clearly see it happens at some levels. And I think that's something which, you know, you have at one end militant evangelical atheism, at another end you have Muslim scholars or otherwise who are very anti-science in a sense, and not necessarily, you know, taking into the possibility that this could evolve even within the Quranic context. So I think that's something that's I think is very important. And just a quick example is, a few years ago, we have this thing in the library where, you know, we have an open day about Islam, and I was with a trained Dai, and he was speaking to a Japanese gentleman who was really genuinely interested in Islam. He was asking different questions, and this person was giving very good answers. And then he came to the question of evolution. This guy's from Cambridge, probably a scientist of some sort, and he asked, you know, what does your religion talk about evolution? The supposedly trained guy's answer was, evolution is complete BS, isn't it? You know, there's nothing about it that's true. And this guy's impression about Islam and everything he had built up so far completely went down. So I think my whole point is, I think Muslims also need to understand that you cannot completely exclude this, and there's absolute possibility that's going to happen. And my last point is, your scatter plot is a good example, but I don't completely agree with that example, because you can have a scatter plot with a complete, perfect, or if all dots are completely aligned along an axis, and you can ask 100 people to draw a line, 99 of them will draw a straight line. But in that example, it's not clear what the straight line is, and just like evolution, it's not clear. But in some scientific questions, it's a perfect straight line, and you know, not all of science is random scatter plots.
Yeah. Let me just address the first point. I agree 100% with what you said, which is why I was very careful when I said we do not say it's unscientific. And one of the things which around the country when I go give this talk across universities, is I say we can accept it as a scientific theory. Just like we could have accepted the eternal universe static state model 100 years ago. Now, when we create a false dichotomy between you either accept it totally or you reject it totally. So you either accept it to be absolutely true or you reject it even at a level which you can observe it. Then those two possibilities are a fool's choice. The nuanced approach, which I believe is in line with Islamic orthodoxy, is simply to say this. Let's put aside Darwin's theory of evolution. Any scientific theory at all, we as Muslims can accept. If it is in line with our theology, or if it is not in line with our theology, we can accept it. What can we accept it as? We can accept it as a working model of reality and just leave it there. So, like I mentioned, I'm not sure if you heard me a little while ago when I mentioned, our job as Muslims is not to show it's wrong. Our job as Muslims is to show simply it's not absolute. So if somebody uses it as an excuse to not believe in God, we simply say, well, that doesn't make any sense. If somebody uses it as an excuse to say Islam is wrong, we say, look, we totally agree with you that this scientific theory is a valid scientific theory, but it's not absolute because of these assumptions. Now, in terms of what you mentioned about the cancer research that you're involved in, one of my friends, he's actually a research associate here at Cambridge University, Dr. Farid Khan. He's got his own lab, protein technologies, and this is what he does. He works on cancer cells, and he sees evolution happening in front of me. And I remember once when we went out, he said, look, I don't disagree with evolution, I make money off it, right? Because that's he works in bioengineering. Something I did mention earlier is there's a difference between evolution and Darwinian evolution, which is a historical account, which goes back 4 billion years, right? So we need to be very nuanced, because what we can end up doing is we can end up making Islam look bad by not understanding what we're talking about. And this is extremely important. When Imam Ghazali wanted to address the philosophers, he first wrote a general book on philosophy. So no one thought this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. In fact, some people condemned him for it because they said, how can you make this thing accessible to everyone? Then, when he went on to write The Incoherence of the Philosophers, they had to tackle him. Why? Because he knew what he was talking about. Now, where I actually study, my professor, he teaches epistemology. He teaches philosophy of the knowledge of knowing. How do you know? And in his history of philosophy and skepticism, he's mentioning the Greeks, he's mentioning this, he's mentioning that. And I'm the only Muslim in the class, and he mentions Ghazali, and he praises Ghazali. Now, why does he do that? Ghazali could have simply looked at those people and said, you are wrong because of Islam is right, you're wrong. He could have finished the conversation there. He did say that, but he did that after he studied their works. He knew exactly what they were he was talking about, to the point where today Western academics study him as a philosopher, although he wrote Incoherence of the Philosophers. So when it comes to this particular field, I believe too many people talk, especially public platform, sometimes on YouTube, sometimes in conferences, Muslim speakers who have no idea what they're talking about. And what they'll end up doing is they will, like you said, what happened to that Japanese non-Muslim, make people have a bad impression of Islam or make it look like we are cavemen or whatever, right? So the nuanced approach is this, just to summarize. We can accept it as a valid scientific theory. We just don't accept it to be absolutely true. And for us to not accept it to be absolutely true, we are in line with mainstream secular academics. Even if we weren't Muslims, we could still epistemically justify our position in the identical way. We could say it's not absolute because of these issues. One last point which I wanted to cover about the scattergraph. You're absolutely right that you can have data points which are perfectly in line, you can draw a straight line. I went with this analogy because this is, and I'm trying to break down a philosophical idea, which is the undetermination of theory by observation, right? So the idea I'm trying to convey here is that the same observations can give rise to different theories. Maybe the scattergraph can be a bit misleading, but I want you to consider something. Science uses a limited set of data to come with a general theory. You will always have new observations. And if you have a graph, even if it's a perfect straight line, you might get a novel piece of data in a place which is not in line with that particular theory. Which is why what philosophers of science say is that no scientific theory can fit all observations, and every scientific theory can have alternative, epistemically equal rivals to it, even if you cannot conceptually conceive of them at the time. Let me just unpack that. Basically what he's saying is this, what they're saying is this. Even if there's a theory which explains, if not all, then most of the data or whatever, it's still possible that there will be another theory which is epistemically equal to it, even if we don't know of it today. And this is not an idea which is disagreed upon in philosophy of science. This is an idea which is universally accepted. And one other distinction that we as Muslims need to make is the distinction between evolution and the Darwinian tree, Darwinian history of life. You can have a solid working model of evolution without the tree. You can have a hedge of life, like Lamarck. You can have multiple lines of evolution. And the interesting thing is, any alternative to Darwin's theory will still have to have an element of natural selection. Because natural selection doesn't start with him, it goes back way beyond him. Now, as you are observing in your lab with cancer cells, how you can get genetic mutations and how some certain mutations are passed along in populations and then fixed, right? You can see that in front of you. Now, for me to come along and say what you're seeing is wrong, one, I would say is completely irrational because you're seeing it. Two, I would say Islamically it is wrong for me to tell you that, because there's nothing in Islam which says that that can't happen. There is, of course, in our theology, human chimp ancestry explicitly, right?
But that couldn't.
Sorry, one second. But that doesn't mean that everything else, whatever exists in nature, say if John Baptiste Lamarck was to come back alive, he existed 50 years before Darwin. He was to come here and he was to say, here's my evolutionary model, and he believed in a multiple origins, multiple lines of parallel evolution, and like a hedge of life, right? Not one origin, multiple origins. Now we would be in a difficult situation to try and show how Islam would contradict that. Maybe it would in some way, I'm not sure how conceptually. But my point is, whether Darwin or Lamarck, we can accept either, but accept it as working model of reality, which is falsifiable, not absolute. Anything beyond that we do, we try and show it's wrong, we try and debunk it. I'm against using these terms. All we're going to do is end up making Islam look bad, because one thing that we say, it is not possible for a whale, a cow-like ancestor, like mammal, to evolve into a whale. Say if I make that public statement, say if 300 years from now we find some evidence of that. Number one, there's nothing explicitly in the Quran which tells me that can't happen. Two, what justification do I have to exclude that even as a scientific hypothesis? I don't. The thing what we need to do as Muslims is this. Allah says in the Quran about being careful about what you say, because your eyes, ears, tongues, everything will be questioned. So I'm very careful, and I've said this publicly. When people openly say, no, we must show it's wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, I correct sometimes Muslims and I say, you cannot say that. Everything I've said today, I try and say this in the same way. If there was a secular academic, if he was sitting here, if he could say, okay, I don't agree with you theologically, but philosophically, and your view here is in line with academia. Because we can't have two faces. We can't have one face towards the Muslims, one face towards the non-Muslims, right? As Muslims, we have to speak the truth, whether it's against ourselves, right? So everything that I've said here, and I've actually had in my lectures, I've had atheist academics sit in my lectures, and philosophically they didn't disagree with me. For example, my lecture in Coventry, I had an atheist from Warwick University that came there, and he disagreed with me in terms of Islam, but what I was saying, he didn't disagree with that. And that is the balanced approach. We have to be just, we have to be balanced, and we have to understand we cannot talk about things that we don't understand. And like that da'i that you're speaking about, when he said this particular thing, maybe that one thing he said is the reason why that Japanese person never accepted Islam.
when a scientist, can I just make a comment, simple comment about this?
Okay, but after this, I'm going to have to go.
Yeah, okay.
Because I've got a train to catch. That's what it is.
They were requested to give one example of
Hold on, sir.
mutation.
Explain the answer.
They did not.
Sorry?
Not a single example of mutation which leads to developing species into another species was given. Not a single one. The other thing, we are not talking about providing evidence from within the Quran about falsifying a theory. A scientist is supposed to adopt a scientific approach, is supposed to give the evidence for what he's claiming, and not that we give it the evidence for that this is wrong. There are theories, as you mentioned, fair enough. Scientifically, they have got to provide the evidence. And we're talking about numbers, not everything. Nowadays, they still say, when Newton talks about the law of gravity, he can say, okay, law of gravity, it follows the inverse square law and so on. It can be proven, and it can go the other way around. If this is correct, this should happen, and therefore the two things match together, and it can be proven. There is no single simulation in a computer program that can verify the evolution theory or Darwinism. I'm not talking about the ayah of the Quran or the hadith of Rasulullah. I'm talking in the language that they want to provide. And they need to provide the evidence. This is a simple thing.
Jazakallah khair.